In the winter of 1885, the elegant Fifth Avenue mansion of Eleanor Fairchild stood as a monument to one of New York's most shocking tragedies. Behind its limestone facade and gleaming windows lay secrets so disturbing that the city's most powerful men would go to extraordinary lengths to bury them forever. What began as a grieving widow's attempt to honor her husband's memory would spiral into a nightmare of conspiracy, murder, and madness that claimed not only Eleanor's sanity, but her very life. The official records speak of suicide brought on by hysteria, but recently discovered correspondence hidden within the walls of a demolished Wall Street building tells a far more sinister story. One that reveals how the financial elite of the Gilded Age built their fortunes on carefully orchestrated death, and how they silenced the one woman brave enough to expose their crimes. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Fairchild and the dark secrets that destroyed her, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world. The truth about what happened to Eleanor Fairchild begins not with her death, but with the mysterious circumstances surrounding her husband's final evening alive. New York City in 1885 stood at the pinnacle of America's Gilded Age, a glittering metropolis where unprecedented wealth flowed through the marble halls of Wall Street while immigrants crowded into tenements just blocks away. The city's financial district pulsed with the energy of a new industrial empire, where railroad barons, steel magnates, and banking dynasties amassed fortunes that would have made European royalty envious. Along Fifth Avenue, palatial mansions rose like monuments to this new American aristocracy, their owners hosting elaborate dinner parties and charity galas that determined the social hierarchy of the entire nation. Among these titans of industry was Theodore Fairchild, a man whose financial acumen had made him one of the most feared and respected figures on Wall Street. At 45, Theodore controlled a vast network of investments spanning railroads, mining operations, and manufacturing concerns. His ability to predict market movements with uncanny accuracy had earned him the nickname, the Oracle of Exchange Place. Business rivals whispered that Theodore possessed an almost supernatural gift for knowing exactly when to buy or sell, often making massive profits from the misfortunes of his competitors. Eleanor Catherine Brennan had married Theodore in 1878, transforming overnight from the daughter of a modest Boston merchant into one of New York's most prominent socialites. At 25, she possessed the refined beauty and sharp intelligence that made her the perfect complement to Theodore's ambitions. Eleanor had not married merely for wealth. She genuinely loved her husband and admired his brilliant mind. She threw herself into the role of a society hostess with remarkable skill, organizing charity events that raised thousands for the city's orphanages and hosting intimate dinner parties where the most powerful men in America conducted their business over fine wine and imported cigars. The Fairchild mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue reflected their status perfectly. Built in the latest French Second Empire style, the four-story limestone palace featured soaring ceilings, hand-carved marble staircases, and rooms filled with European antiques and original paintings. The mansion's crown jewel was Theodore's private study, a wood-paneled sanctuary lined with leather-bound books and featuring a massive safe where he kept his most confidential business documents. Eleanor had always respected her husband's need for privacy in his business affairs, understanding that the world of high finance required absolute discretion. Their marriage, while arranged initially through family connections, had blossomed into genuine partnership. Theodore often sought Eleanor's counsel on social matters, recognizing her exceptional ability to read people and situations. She, in turn, had developed a sophisticated understanding of business and finance through their conversations, though she was careful never to overstep the boundaries of what society considered appropriate for a woman of her station. They had no children, a source of private sadness for Eleanor, but Theodore's devotion to his work and her commitment to their social obligations had filled their lives with purpose and meaning. The New York of 1885 was a city of stark contradictions. While the wealthy dined on 7-course meals in gilded dining rooms, newspaper headlines regularly reported on financial panics that left thousands of working families destitute. The recent completion of the Brooklyn Bridge had symbolized American ingenuity and progress. Yet labor strikes and industrial accidents claimed lives with disturbing frequency. In this environment, men like Theodore Fairchild wielded enormous power, their decisions capable of affecting the livelihoods of thousands of workers and the fortunes of entire cities. What Eleanor didn't yet understand was that her husband's remarkable success had come at a price far more terrible than she could have imagined. The evening of November 17, 1885, began like countless others in the Fairchild household. Eleanor had spent the afternoon preparing for one of their regular business dinners, ensuring that every detail met Theodore's exacting standards. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, while the kitchen staff prepared a menu of roasted duck, imported oysters, and charlotte russe, Theodore's favorite dessert. These gatherings were more than social events. They were carefully orchestrated meetings where some of New York's most influential financiers conducted their most sensitive business. That evening's guests included Harrison Kensington, a silver-haired banker who controlled much of the city's railroad financing; Marcus Cromwell, a sharp-featured man whose shipping empire dominated the East Coast ports; and James Wainwright, the youngest of the group at 38, whose family's textile mills had made him enormously wealthy. Eleanor had hosted these 3 men dozens of times, and she had come to recognize the subtle dynamics between them. Theodore clearly held the position of leadership, while the others deferred to his judgment with an almost military precision. As the evening progressed, Eleanor noticed an unusual tension in the air. The men's conversation, typically animated with discussions of market opportunities and political developments, carried an undercurrent of anxiety that she hadn't observed before. During the soup course, she caught fragments of whispered exchanges, mentions of the Pittsburgh situation and references to someone called the problem that needed to be resolved permanently. When she attempted to join the conversation with a light comment about recent social gossip, the table fell silent in a way that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Theodore, normally solicitous of her comfort, seemed distracted and unusually pale. She noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wineglass, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool November evening. When she quietly asked if he was feeling well, he assured her it was merely the stress of a particularly complex business negotiation, but his eyes held a haunted quality she had never seen before. The dinner proceeded through its courses with increasing awkwardness. The men's voices dropped to barely audible murmurs whenever sensitive topics arose, and Eleanor found herself excluded from conversations that had previously included her observations about social and political matters. She began to feel like an unwelcome intruder in her own dining room, a sensation that both puzzled and hurt her deeply. It was during the serving of the charlotte russe that everything changed. Theodore had just raised his spoon to his lips when he suddenly gasped, his face contorting in pain. The silver spoon clattered to his plate as he clutched his chest, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Eleanor rushed to his side, but before she could reach him, Theodore collapsed forward onto the table, sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor and staining the white tablecloth with dark red wine that looked disturbingly like blood. "Theodore!" Eleanor's scream echoed through the mansion as she knelt beside her husband's chair. His eyes were wide with terror, and his lips moved as if he were trying to speak, but only a terrible, gasping sound emerged. Harrison Kensington immediately took charge, sending Marcus Cromwell to fetch the family physician while ordering the servants to clear the room. Eleanor found herself gently but firmly guided away from Theodore's body by James Wainwright, who assured her that Dr. Henley would know exactly what to do. Dr. Percival Henley arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his face grave with professional concern. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he examined Theodore's motionless form, checking for vital signs with the practiced efficiency of a man who had attended many such emergencies among the city's elite. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Henley straightened and shook his head solemnly. "I'm afraid, Mr. "Fairchild has passed away," he announced in a voice that carried both sympathy and authority. "Given his recent complaints about chest pains and the obvious stress of his business obligations, I believe we're looking at a fatal heart attack. Such tragedies are unfortunately common among men of his age and responsibilities." Eleanor's world collapsed in that moment. The man who had been her partner, her protector, and her greatest love was gone, taken from her without warning or the chance for a final goodbye. Through her tears, she was dimly aware of the other men speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Henley, making arrangements for the body and discussing the necessary legal formalities. Their efficiency in handling the crisis seemed almost unseemly in its swiftness, but Eleanor was too overwhelmed by grief to question their actions. What she didn't notice in her devastation was the brief exchange of meaningful glances between the three surviving dinner guests, or the way Dr. Henley nodded slightly when Harrison Kensington whispered something in his ear. She didn't observe how Marcus Cromwell quietly retrieved Theodore's wineglass and dinner plate, or how James Wainwright made a subtle gesture that caused the butler to clear the entire table with unusual haste. In the days that followed, as Eleanor struggled to comprehend her new reality as a widow, the official story solidified around Theodore's sudden death. The newspapers reported that one of Wall Street's most brilliant minds had succumbed to the pressures of high finance, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing oneself too hard in pursuit of success. Friends and business associates expressed their condolences while praising Theodore's remarkable career and lamenting the loss of such a gifted financier. But Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of her husband's terrified eyes in those final moments, or the strange behavior of his dinner companions. Something about that evening felt fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't yet articulate what had disturbed her so deeply. The weeks following Theodore's funeral passed in a haze of condolence visits and legal consultations. Eleanor found herself navigating an entirely new world of financial documents, business partnerships, and legal obligations that had previously been her husband's exclusive domain. Theodore's attorney, the distinguished Cornelius Dalton, guided her through the complexities of the estate with paternal kindness, explaining that Theodore's vast holdings were now hers to manage, or as he delicately suggested, to entrust to more experienced hands. The Fairchild financial empire proved to be even more extensive than Eleanor had realized. Beyond the obvious railroad investments and mining interests, Theodore had maintained a complex web of holdings that included everything from shipping companies to manufacturing concerns, newspaper interests to banking partnerships. The paperwork seemed endless: stock certificates, bond holdings, partnership agreements, and correspondence with business associates across the continent. Each document required Eleanor's signature. Each decision demanded her immediate attention. What struck Eleanor as peculiar was the remarkable timing of Theodore's investments. Time and again, she discovered that her husband had made brilliant financial moves just days or weeks before major market developments. He had sold railroad stocks just before a devastating train accident that destroyed an entire line's reputation. He had purchased mining claims shortly before competing operations suffered mysterious cave-ins or equipment failures that eliminated their competitive advantage. He had invested heavily in shipping companies immediately before their rivals experienced a series of catastrophic accidents that removed them from lucrative trade routes. Initially, Eleanor attributed these coincidences to Theodore's exceptional business acumen. The man she had married possessed an almost supernatural ability to read market trends and anticipate industrial developments. But as she delved deeper into his records, patterns began to emerge that troubled her increasingly analytical mind. The timing wasn't just fortunate, it was impossibly precise, as if Theodore had possessed advanced knowledge of disasters that befell his competitors. Among Theodore's personal papers, Eleanor discovered a locked drawer in his study that neither she nor the household staff had ever seen opened. When the locksmith finally managed to open it, Eleanor found herself staring at documents that challenged everything she thought she knew about her husband's business methods. The drawer contained detailed newspaper clippings about industrial accidents, train derailments, and sudden deaths of rival businessmen, each carefully dated and annotated in Theodore's precise handwriting. More disturbing still were the coded telegrams and cryptic correspondence with men whose names Eleanor didn't recognize. Letters signed with initials rather than full names, discussing solutions to problematic situations and referring to permanent resolutions of business conflicts. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications sent chills down Eleanor's spine. These weren't the communications of legitimate business negotiations. They read more like the planning documents for criminal enterprises. One particular letter, dated just 3 weeks before Theodore's death, caught Eleanor's attention. Written on expensive paper with no letterhead, it was signed simply HK and discussed the Pittsburgh problem that Eleanor remembered being mentioned at that fatal dinner party. The letter spoke of the need for decisive action and assured Theodore that our associate has been contacted and understands the urgency of the situation. The letter concluded with a cryptic reference to a substantial payment that had been arranged for services rendered. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held this correspondence. Harrison Kensington shared those initials, and she clearly remembered his presence at numerous business dinners where similar coded conversations had taken place. Could the distinguished banker who had comforted her in her time of grief actually be involved in something sinister? The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence before her eyes suggested connections she couldn't ignore. Her investigation took on an increasingly obsessive quality as winter deepened into the harsh New York January of 1886. Eleanor spent hours in Theodore's study, poring over documents and attempting to decode the true meaning behind his business correspondence. She began to map out timelines, connecting Theodore's investment decisions with subsequent disasters that befell his competitors. The patterns that emerged painted a picture of systematic manipulation of markets through what could only be described as deliberately orchestrated catastrophes. The more Eleanor uncovered, the more isolated she became from her former social circle. Friends who had once competed for invitations to her dinner parties now seemed uncomfortable in her presence, their conversations becoming stilted and artificial whenever she attempted to discuss Theodore's business affairs. At charity events and social gatherings, Eleanor noticed how quickly conversations stopped when she approached, and how people's eyes seemed to avoid meeting hers directly. Dr. Henley, who had pronounced Theodore dead, began making increasingly frequent social calls to check on Eleanor's emotional state. His visits, while ostensibly motivated by professional concern for a grieving widow, carried undertones that made Eleanor deeply uncomfortable. He would ask probing questions about how she was spending her time, whether she was dwelling too much on the past, and if she had been experiencing any nervous symptoms that might require medical attention. When Eleanor mentioned her interest in understanding Theodore's business affairs, Dr. Henley's expression would darken with what he described as concern for her delicate constitution. Most troubling of all was Eleanor's growing realization that she was being watched. Servants she didn't recognize began appearing on Fifth Avenue at odd hours, their eyes seeming to track her movements whenever she left the mansion. Letters that she was certain she had placed in specific locations in Theodore's study would be moved slightly, as if someone had been examining them during her absence. The feeling of being under constant surveillance grew so strong that Eleanor began to question her own perceptions, wondering if grief was driving her toward paranoia. As winter gave way to spring, Eleanor's investigation had revealed enough disturbing evidence to convince her that Theodore's death had been no natural heart attack, and that his business success had come through means that violated every moral principle she held dear. But the depth of the conspiracy she was uncovering and the power of the men who seemed to be involved made her realize that her own life might now be in danger. The question that haunted her sleepless nights was no longer just what had Theodore done, but who was watching her now and what they might be willing to do to protect their secrets. Spring of 1886 brought with it a renewed determination as Eleanor decided to move beyond passive investigation and take active steps to uncover the truth about her husband's business dealings. Her transformation from grieving widow to determined investigator had been gradual but profound, driven by the mounting evidence that Theodore's death was connected to something far more sinister than simple business competition. Eleanor's first breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook who had worked in the Fairchild household for nearly 6 years. Margaret had always been more observant than the other servants, and her loyalty to Eleanor had deepened during the difficult months following Theodore's death. One morning in April, as Eleanor reviewed financial documents in the breakfast room, Margaret approached with obvious nervousness. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild," Margaret began in her soft Dublin accent, "but there's something I've been wanting to tell you about the night Mr. Theodore passed. God rest his soul." Margaret's weathered hands twisted her apron as she continued. "I was in the kitchen when Dr. Henley left that evening, and I saw him speaking with Mr. Kensington by the garden gate. They didn't know I was watching through the pantry window, but I heard Mr. Kensington say something that's been troubling me fierce." Eleanor set down her papers and gave Margaret her full attention. The cook had proven herself trustworthy over the years, and her observations often carried insights that others missed. "Mr. Kensington said, clear as day, the dose was perfect. No one will ever suspect." And then Dr. Henley replied, "Just remember our agreement about the widow. She must never learn what we know." They shook hands like they were sealing some kind of bargain, ma'am, and it's been eating at me ever since. The implications of Margaret's revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. If the cook's account was accurate, then Theodore had indeed been murdered, and Dr. Henley had been complicit in both the killing and the subsequent cover-up. The dose could only refer to poison, administered with such skill that it mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack. Eleanor's grief transformed into cold rage as she realized that the men she had trusted to comfort her in her darkest hour had actually been her husband's killers. Armed with this new information, Eleanor began to examine Theodore's death from an entirely different perspective. She recalled how Dr. Henley had arrived suspiciously quickly that evening, almost as if he had been expecting the emergency call. She remembered the efficient way the dinner guests had managed the crisis, their practiced coordination suggesting prior experience with such situations. Most tellingly, she now understood why Theodore's dinner companions had been so nervous throughout the evening. They had been waiting for their plan to unfold. Eleanor's investigation intensified as she sought to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. She began making discreet inquiries about the men who had been present at that fatal dinner, learning details about their business practices that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Harrison Kensington, she discovered, had been involved in at least a dozen railroad investments that had profited enormously from the mysterious failures of competing lines. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire had expanded through the systematic acquisition of rival companies that had suffered inexplicable runs of bad luck, fires, accidents, and equipment failures that had forced them into bankruptcy. James Wainwright's textile operations had similarly benefited from the misfortunes of competitors, and Eleanor began to notice that all three men shared certain characteristics. Their businesses consistently profited from their rivals' disasters. Their success coincided with a remarkable string of accidental deaths among competing businessmen, and their social circles overlapped in ways that suggested careful coordination rather than coincidence. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic market manipulation through violence. These men weren't simply successful businessmen. They were operating what could only be described as a murder-for-profit enterprise, eliminating competition through carefully planned assassinations disguised as accidents, suicides, or natural deaths. Theodore had clearly been a central figure in this conspiracy, his analytical mind perfect for identifying targets and timing attacks for maximum financial benefit. Eleanor's discovery of this network explained Theodore's uncanny ability to predict market movements. He hadn't been predicting them, he had been orchestrating them through violence. Every brilliant investment, every perfectly timed stock purchase, every fortunate coincidence had been built on someone else's murder. The fortune that had provided Eleanor with her luxurious lifestyle, her social position, and her comfortable security had been purchased with blood. As Eleanor's understanding of the conspiracy deepened, so did her sense of personal danger. She began to notice that her social isolation was becoming more pronounced and deliberate. Invitations to important social events stopped arriving. Longtime friends began declining her dinner invitations with transparent excuses, and business associates who had once competed for her attention now seemed uncomfortable even acknowledging her presence on the street. More ominously, Eleanor realized that her own activities were being monitored with increasing intensity. Letters disappeared from her study, only to reappear in slightly different positions. Servants she didn't recognize appeared in her household, recommended by employment agencies that Harrison Kensington's office had suggested. Her personal correspondence was clearly being intercepted, as she noticed that responses to her letters often addressed concerns she had never explicitly mentioned. The psychological pressure was beginning to affect Eleanor's daily life in ways she couldn't ignore. She found herself jumping at sudden sounds, checking locks multiple times before retiring, and experiencing a persistent feeling of being watched, even in the privacy of her own home. Sleep became elusive as she lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old mansion, wondering if tonight would be the night they decided she had learned too much. Dr. Henley's visits increased in frequency, his medical examinations becoming more intrusive and his questions more pointed. He began suggesting that Eleanor's nervous condition might require more aggressive treatment, perhaps even a period of rest at a private sanitarium where she could receive the specialized care that her delicate mental state required. The threat implicit in these suggestions was unmistakable: comply with their wishes or face involuntary commitment to an institution where her credibility would be permanently destroyed. Eleanor realized that she was racing against time. The conspirators were clearly preparing to silence her, either through commitment to an asylum or through more permanent means. Her only hope lay in gathering enough evidence to expose their crimes before they could eliminate her as a threat. But every day brought new risks, and Eleanor could feel the net closing around her with terrifying inevitability. The woman who had once hosted elegant dinner parties for New York's elite now found herself living in constant fear. Her own home transformed into a prison where she was both captive and target. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest, and Eleanor was acutely aware that she was playing for her very life. By summer of 1886, Eleanor's investigation had uncovered evidence that extended far beyond the three men she had initially suspected. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of New York society, encompassing judges, police officials, newspaper editors, and even members of the city's Board of Health. What she had discovered was not merely a business partnership between a few wealthy men, but a vast criminal network that had been operating with virtual impunity for at least a decade. Eleanor's most damning discovery came in the form of a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a false back in Theodore's office safe. The ledger, written entirely in Theodore's careful handwriting, contained detailed records of what could only be described as assassination contracts. Each entry included the target's name, the reason for their elimination, usually described as market impediment or competitive interference, the method to be employed, the payment schedule, and the date of completion. The entries were chillingly methodical in their detail. A railroad executive named Thomas Crawford had been resolved through a carriage accident on October 15, 1883, resulting in profitable stock acquisitions worth $180,000. A shipping magnate called Robert Sinclair had been addressed via apparent suicide on March 22, 1884, allowing for the acquisition of 3 profitable trade routes. A textile manufacturer named William Hayes had been concluded through a factory fire that claimed his life along with 17 workers, generating insurance payouts and business opportunities worth over $200,000. Most horrifying of all was the discovery that the conspiracy maintained a network of professional killers who operated throughout the Northeast. These men, referred to in the ledger only by numbers rather than names, specialized in different types of elimination. Agent 7 handled accidents involving carriages and horses. Agent 12 arranged industrial mishaps and building fires, while Agent 23 had perfected the art of poisoning that left no detectable traces. The ledger revealed that Theodore had served as the network's primary strategist, identifying targets whose deaths would create the maximum market disruption and profit potential. His role had been to analyze business competitors, assess their vulnerabilities, and recommend the most financially advantageous timing for their elimination. The other conspirators had handled the practical arrangements. Kensington managed the financial aspects and money laundering. Cromwell coordinated the logistics of the actual killings, and Wainwright maintained the network of corrupt officials who ensured that investigations never proceeded beyond superficial inquiries. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she read the final entries in the ledger. The last completed contract, dated November 10, 1885, just 1 week before Theodore's death, involved the elimination of a Pittsburgh steel manufacturer whose factories competed directly with Wainwright's operations. But it was the final, incomplete entry that made Eleanor's hands shake with terror. E.F. Widow, excessive curiosity, permanent resolution required, to be arranged. The initials were unmistakably her own. Eleanor Fairchild had become the conspiracy's next target. Eleanor's discovery of her own assassination order galvanized her into immediate action, but also filled her with paralyzing fear. She now understood that every day she remained in New York brought her closer to a carefully planned death. The conspirators had already been laying the groundwork for her elimination through Dr. Henley's repeated suggestions about her mental instability. Her death would likely be attributed to suicide, brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion, a tragic but understandable end for a widow who had never recovered from her husband's sudden passing. The psychological warfare intensified dramatically once Eleanor realized she was marked for death. Strange accidents began occurring with alarming frequency. A chandelier in the dining room crashed to the floor minutes after she had been standing beneath it. A gas valve in her bedroom was discovered to be leaking, thankfully caught by Margaret's keen nose before Eleanor retired for the night. And her carriage suffered a mysterious wheel failure while traveling down Fifth Avenue that could have resulted in serious injury or death. Each incident was carefully crafted to appear accidental, but the timing and frequency made clear that these were deliberate attempts on her life. Eleanor realized that the conspirators were testing different methods, perhaps trying to determine which would appear most natural and raise the fewest questions. The psychological effect was devastating. Eleanor found herself unable to trust anything in her environment, from the food she ate to the stairs she climbed. Dr. Henley's visits became increasingly aggressive in their medical assessments. He began bringing a colleague, Dr. Reginald Steinberg, who specialized in nervous disorders and institutional commitment procedures. Together they subjected Eleanor to lengthy examinations that focused on her mental state rather than her physical health. Their questions grew more invasive and accusatory. Did she believe people were plotting against her? Had she been experiencing paranoid delusions about her late husband's business associates? Was she having difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination? Eleanor realized that the doctors were building a medical case for her involuntary commitment to an asylum. Once institutionalized, she would be completely powerless to expose the conspiracy, and her eventual death could be attributed to the progression of her mental illness. The thought of being trapped in one of the era's notorious private sanitariums, subjected to the primitive and often brutal treatments used on hysterical women, filled Eleanor with a terror that went beyond fear of death itself. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Eleanor's situation intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Eleanor's desperate fight for survival. Eleanor's desperation led her to make a decision that would either save her life or hasten her death. She would attempt to gather irrefutable proof of the conspiracy and present it to authorities who were not part of the network. Her plan was ambitious and dangerous. She would document everything she had discovered, create multiple copies of the evidence, and simultaneously present her findings to federal authorities, major newspapers, and law enforcement officials in other cities. Working in absolute secrecy, Eleanor spent nights photographing pages from Theodore's ledger using a small camera she had purchased discreetly. She created detailed written accounts of everything she had learned, including Margaret's testimony about the conversation between Dr. Henley and Kensington. She compiled lists of suspicious deaths that corresponded to the conspiracy's profitable investments, creating a timeline that demonstrated the systematic nature of the murder scheme. Eleanor's plan required her to maintain an appearance of normalcy while secretly preparing her evidence. She continued to attend social functions, submitted to Dr. Henley's examinations, and maintained the facade of a grieving widow, slowly succumbing to nervous exhaustion. But beneath this performance, she was preparing for what she knew would be her only chance to expose the truth and save her own life. The stakes could not have been higher. Eleanor was playing a desperate game against opponents who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill without hesitation. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly as the conspirators prepared their final move against her. The evidence she had gathered would either vindicate her allegations and destroy one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history, or it would die with her, ensuring that their secrets remained buried forever. As summer turned to autumn, Eleanor could feel the tension reaching its breaking point. The next few days would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether she would become just another entry in Theodore's ledger of perfectly executed murders. The first week of October 1886 brought unseasonably warm weather to New York City, but Eleanor felt nothing but cold dread as she prepared to execute her desperate plan. She had arranged to meet with 3 different contacts on the same day: a federal prosecutor who handled interstate commerce crimes, the editor of the Herald Tribune, a newspaper not owned by any of the conspirators, and a police detective from Philadelphia who had no connections to New York's corrupt system. Eleanor's strategy was simple but risky: present her evidence simultaneously to multiple authorities, making it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress all investigations. She had created 4 complete sets of documentation, including photographs of Theodore's assassination ledger, copies of the coded correspondence, Margaret's written testimony, and her own detailed analysis connecting the murders to specific financial gains. 3 sets would go to her contacts, while the 4th would be hidden in a safety deposit box at a bank outside the conspirators' influence. On the morning of October 8th, Eleanor rose early and dressed with particular care, understanding that this might be her final day of freedom or her final day alive. She had arranged to meet the federal prosecutor at 10 a.m., the newspaper editor at 2 p.m., and the Philadelphia detective at 5 p.m. Each meeting was scheduled at a different location to minimize the chances of the conspirators tracking her movements and preventing all 3 encounters. Eleanor's first indication that her plan had been discovered came as she prepared to leave for her morning appointment. Margaret approached her with obvious distress, reporting that 2 unfamiliar men were positioned on the street corners near the mansion, and that Dr. Henley had arrived unexpectedly, claiming he needed to conduct an urgent medical examination. "He's in the front parlor, ma'am, and he's brought that other doctor with him again," Margaret whispered urgently. "He says you're having a medical emergency and that he needs to see you immediately. But ma'am, you look perfectly well to me, and his manner is most strange. He seems nervous and keeps checking his pocket watch." Eleanor's heart raced as she realized that the conspirators had somehow learned of her plans and were moving to stop her. Dr. Henley's presence, combined with the suspicious men outside, suggested that they intended to have her committed immediately, preventing her from keeping any of her appointments. Once she was in their custody, claiming medical authority over her, they could ensure that her evidence never reached the authorities. Eleanor made a split-second decision that would determine her fate. Rather than confront Dr. Henley directly, she instructed Margaret to tell him that she was feeling faint and would need a few moments to compose herself before the examination. Using the servant's stairs, Eleanor quickly retrieved her prepared evidence packets and escaped through the mansion's rear entrance, which opened onto a narrow alley that connected to 48th Street. Eleanor's flight through the streets of Manhattan became a desperate race against time and her pursuers. She could see men following her as she made her way toward the Federal Building, their presence confirming that the conspiracy had mobilized significant resources to stop her. Eleanor's plan began to unravel as she realized that her pursuers seemed to anticipate her destinations, suggesting that they had somehow learned the details of her appointments. The federal prosecutor's office delivered the first devastating blow to Eleanor's hopes. When she arrived at the building, breathless and terrified, she was informed that Prosecutor Williams had been called away on an emergency and would not be available for their scheduled meeting. The clerk's explanation seemed rehearsed, and Eleanor noticed that he avoided making eye contact as he delivered the news. She left the evidence packet anyway, insisting that it be given to Williams upon his return, but she had little confidence that it would ever reach him. Eleanor's afternoon appointment with the newspaper editor proved even more disastrous. When she arrived at the Herald Tribune offices, she was informed that Editor Morrison had suddenly taken ill and had been hospitalized that very morning. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Eleanor realized that the conspiracy's reach extended even further than she had imagined. They had somehow identified her contacts and neutralized them before her evidence could be presented. Desperation drove Eleanor to attempt her final appointment with the Philadelphia detective, even though she suspected it too would prove futile. Detective Patrick Kelly had agreed to meet her at Grand Central Station, planning to return to Philadelphia on the evening train after reviewing her evidence. Eleanor arrived early, hoping that the public nature of the location might provide some protection from her pursuers. Detective Kelly proved to be Eleanor's last hope and her final disappointment. When she approached him at their agreed-upon meeting point near the main departure board, Kelly's expression was one of barely concealed hostility rather than the professional interest she had expected. His first words confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. "Mrs. Fairchild, I've been contacted by some very concerned parties about your condition. Dr. Henley has explained your situation to me in great detail." Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she realized that the conspiracy had reached even this distant contact. Detective Kelly had been compromised, probably through a combination of bribes and carefully crafted lies about her mental state. The evidence packet she had intended to give him would never see the light of day, and her final avenue for justice had been closed before she could even attempt to use it. "Detective Kelly, please listen to me," Eleanor pleaded, her voice carrying the desperation of a woman who knew she was running out of time. "The evidence I have will prove that my husband and his associates have been murdering people for profit. There's a ledger that documents dozens of assassinations, and I can prove that Theodore was poisoned at our dinner table." Kelly's response was gentle, but firm, the tone one might use with a dangerous mental patient. "Ma'am, Dr. Henley has explained about your delusions. You've been under tremendous strain since your husband's passing, and it's affected your ability to think clearly. The best thing for you now is to come with me peacefully. Dr. Henley is waiting outside with an ambulance that will take you to a private facility where you can get the help you need." Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that she had been outmaneuvered completely. The conspirators had anticipated every move she might make, neutralizing her contacts and preparing a final trap that would remove her from society permanently. The private facility Kelly mentioned would be her prison and eventually her grave, a place where her death could be attributed to the progressive deterioration of her mental health. In that moment of absolute despair, Eleanor made one final, desperate decision. She would not go quietly to her destruction. If she was going to die, she would at least attempt to create a public scene that might draw attention to her plight. With sudden violence, she broke away from Detective Kelly and ran toward the crowded main concourse of the station, screaming about murder and conspiracy at the top of her lungs. "They killed my husband. Harrison Kensington and Marcus Cromwell are murderers. They've been killing people for money. Eleanor's voice echoed through the vast space as dozens of travelers turned to stare at the elegantly dressed woman who appeared to be having a complete mental breakdown. Dr. Henley poisoned Theodore. They're trying to kill me to keep me quiet. The scene that followed was exactly what the conspirators had planned for. Eleanor's public hysteria, witnessed by scores of respectable citizens, provided perfect evidence of her mental instability. Dr. Henley appeared as if summoned, accompanied by two orderlies in white coats who approached Eleanor with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to handling violent mental patients. "Please, everyone stand back, Doctor," Henley announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying professional authority and deep compassion. "This poor woman has been suffering from severe nervous exhaustion since her husband's death. We're here to help her, but she's been experiencing paranoid delusions that make her believe people are trying to harm her." Eleanor fought against the orderlies who restrained her, continuing to shout accusations that sounded increasingly deranged to the onlookers. The more desperately she tried to explain the conspiracy, the more her words seemed to confirm Dr. Henley's assessment of her mental condition. The very evidence she was trying to present, the complexity of the murder network, the involvement of respected businessmen, the systematic nature of the killings, sounded like the elaborate fantasies of a mind that had lost touch with reality. As the orderlies carried Eleanor toward the waiting ambulance, she caught sight of Harrison Kensington watching from the shadows near the station's entrance. His expression was one of satisfied calculation, the look of a man whose carefully laid plans had reached their successful conclusion. Eleanor understood in that moment that everything, her isolation, the staged accidents, the medical examinations, even this final public breakdown, had been orchestrated to achieve exactly this result. The last thing Eleanor saw as the ambulance doors closed was Detective Kelly shaking hands with Dr. Henley, accepting what appeared to be an envelope thick with cash. Her final hope of justice disappeared as she realized that even her supposedly independent contact had been bought and paid for by the very men she was trying to expose. Eleanor Catherine Fairchild was committed to the Westchester Private Sanitarium on October 8, 1886, under the medical authority of Dr. Percival Henley and Dr. Reginald Steinberg. The facility, located in a remote area of Westchester County, specialized in treating wealthy patients suffering from nervous disorders and mental ailments that might prove embarrassing to their families. It was exactly the kind of discreet institution where inconvenient people could disappear without generating unwanted public attention. The sanitarium's records, meticulously maintained by the staff, documented Eleanor's rapid deterioration from the moment of her arrival. According to Dr. Henley's initial assessment, the patient suffered from acute paranoid hysteria brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion. Her claims about murder conspiracies were classified as elaborate delusions typical of the hysterical female mind under extreme stress. Eleanor's treatment followed the standard protocols of the era for dealing with difficult female patients. She was confined to a private room, denied visitors outside of immediate family, of which she had none, and subjected to a regime of cold water treatments, prolonged bed rest, and gradually increasing doses of medicinal opiates designed to calm her agitated mental state. Her requests to contact authorities or send letters were denied on medical grounds, with Dr. Henley explaining that such activities would only reinforce her dangerous delusions. Margaret O'Brien made several attempts to visit Eleanor during the first weeks of her confinement, but was turned away each time with explanations that the patient was too unstable to receive visitors. The loyal cook's persistence eventually earned her a meeting with Dr. Henley himself, who patiently explained that Eleanor's condition was deteriorating rapidly and that outside contact might trigger violent episodes that could endanger both Eleanor and the staff. What Margaret didn't know was that her own days were numbered. On November 15, 1886, exactly 1 month after Eleanor's commitment, Margaret O'Brien was found dead in her small apartment near the Fairchild mansion. The police report attributed her death to a gas leak from a faulty stove, a tragic accident that claimed the life of a hard-working immigrant woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The timing ensured that the only witness to the conversation between Dr. Henley and Harrison Kensington would never be able to testify about what she had overheard. Eleanor's own end came with the cruel inevitability that the conspirators had planned from the beginning. On December 3, 1886, after nearly 2 months of institutional confinement and increasing doses of laudanum, Eleanor was found dead in her room at the Westchester Sanitarium. Dr. Henley's official report attributed her death to cardiac failure brought on by the progressive deterioration of her nervous system and the toxic effects of prolonged mental anguish. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Henley and countersigned by Dr. Steinberg, made no mention of the massive dose of morphine that had actually stopped Eleanor's heart. The drugs had been administered during what the medical records described as a therapeutic treatment for severe agitation, but which had actually been a carefully calculated execution disguised as medical care. Eleanor's funeral was a modest affair, attended primarily by former servants and a handful of society acquaintances who felt obligated to pay their respects. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, and James Wainwright all attended, playing their roles as concerned friends who had tried unsuccessfully to help a troubled widow overcome her tragic decline into madness. Their expressions of sympathy were masterful performances, conveying just the right mixture of sadness and relief that Eleanor's suffering had finally ended. The New York Times ran a brief obituary that portrayed Eleanor as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled grief. The article described how the sudden loss of her beloved husband had triggered a mental collapse that led to increasingly bizarre delusions about business conspiracies and assassination plots. The obituary praised Dr. Henley's heroic efforts to treat Eleanor's condition, while noting that some forms of female hysteria proved resistant to even the most advanced medical interventions. Eleanor's estate was quickly settled by Cornelius Dalton, who had been appointed as executor of her will. The Fairchild fortune, valued at over $2 million, was distributed according to Theodore's previous instructions in ways that greatly benefited his former business partners. Harrison Kensington's bank received substantial deposits. Marcus Cromwell acquired several profitable shipping investments at below-market prices, and James Wainwright gained control of textile operations that complemented his existing business empire. The mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue was sold to a railroad magnate from Chicago, and all of Theodore's business records were carefully destroyed during the estate settlement process. Cornelius Dalton explained that the documents contained sensitive financial information that could damage the reputations of various business associates if they became public. The destruction was carried out under the supervision of Harrison Kensington, ensuring that no trace remained of the assassination ledger or the coded correspondence that had revealed the conspiracy's existence. With Eleanor's death, the murder-for-profit network continued its operations with renewed confidence. The elimination of both Theodore Fairchild and his widow had demonstrated the organization's ability to handle internal threats while maintaining their public facades as respectable businessmen. Over the following years, the conspiracy expanded its operations, eventually extending its influence throughout the Northeast and into the industrial centers of the Midwest. Dr. Percival Henley's reputation was enhanced by his handling of the Fairchild case, and he became a sought-after specialist in treating the nervous disorders of wealthy women. His private practice flourished, and he developed particular expertise in cases where female patients exhibited paranoid tendencies that required institutional treatment. The good doctor's success rate in curing such ailments was remarkable, though his patients had an unusually high mortality rate that he attributed to the severity of their mental conditions. The Westchester Private Sanitarium continued to operate for another 15 years, serving as a discreet repository for inconvenient individuals whose presence had become problematic for powerful interests. The facility's records were destroyed in a convenient fire in 1902, ensuring that no evidence remained of the questionable deaths that had occurred within its walls. By the early 1900s, most of the original members of the murder conspiracy had died of natural causes. taking their secrets to graves marked with elaborate monuments that celebrated their contributions to American business and society. Harrison Kensington was remembered as a philanthropist who had donated millions to build hospitals and schools. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire became a cornerstone of American international trade. James Wainwright's textile operations provided employment for thousands of workers and helped establish the industrial foundation of the modern economy. Their true legacy lived on in the criminal networks they had established, which continued to operate long after their deaths. The methods they had pioneered, the systematic elimination of business competition through violence, the corruption of medical and legal authorities, the use of mental health institutions to silence inconvenient witnesses, became templates that would be copied by criminal organizations for generations to come. Eleanor Fairchild's story disappeared into the archives of forgotten tragedies, remembered only as a footnote in the occasional academic study of women's mental health in the Gilded Age. Her name appeared in no history books, her warnings went unheeded, and her evidence was lost forever. The brave woman who had risked everything to expose one of America's most dangerous criminal conspiracies became just another statistic in the era's epidemic of female hysteria and nervous breakdown. This mystery shows us how power and wealth can corrupt even the most fundamental institutions of justice and medicine, turning them into weapons against the innocent. The story of Eleanor Fairchild reminds us that throughout history, those who have tried to expose the crimes of the powerful have often paid the ultimate price for their courage. Her tragedy serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary men who have convinced themselves that their wealth and status place them above the laws that govern everyone else. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such conspiracies could have operated in the shadows of America's Gilded Age? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about Eleanor's tragic fate. If you enjoyed this tale of historical horror and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves exploring the sinister secrets that history tried to bury. Until next time, remember that the most frightening stories are often the ones that could be true.